And I want to distinguish from the outset, we're not speaking today about living organ donation, about altruistic organ donation, in particular with regard to kidneys, which has become very well accepted, both halachically and culturally in our community. As you might know, the state of Israel has the highest per capita rate of living organ donation, kidneys in particular, occasionally liver lobes as well, but really kidneys is the focus here. And in the United States, Jews have a disproportionate percentage of those who are donating kidneys, by far the largest population group that donate kidneys. And this is a wonderful phenomenon, particularly because kidneys are the organ which is most needed in the waiting list. There are about, let's say, in the United States alone, about 107, 110,000 people a given day that are waiting for organs, and the strong majority of them are waiting for kidneys. That's because we can keep people alive when they have kidney failure because of dialysis. Dialysis doesn't work forever, and it's not a perfect solution, but that can keep the possibility of keeping people alive and being healthy enough to receive an organ transplant, kidney transplant. And that's why kidney donation has become very prominent and very important. And that's a wonderful phenomenon. The topic which we're going to be focused on is the issue of posthumous organ donation. That is to say, once a person has passed away, before they are buried, can their organs be retrieved and transplanted into someone else? We have an Matai initiative that's called Option 18. It's called Option 18. Obviously, 18 is Chai, but 18 also is the numbers 1 and 8. And in the organ transplant community world, they speak about the fact that one person can donate up to 8 life-saving organs, which of course is a remarkable phenomenon. And this is Ma'aseh B'chol Yom, that people get saved every day through organ donation, but the vast majority of people die while waiting on the transplant list. And this is true wherever you are in the world. But certainly places like America or Israel, where just the numbers are that the number of organ donors simply aren't enough in order to get people off the organ transplant list. And that might be even true if every single person who could donate an organ did organ donate. It's a little bit of a debate about how much that is, but certainly the number would be higher if more people would choose to choose organ donation. But the possibility, as we're going to discuss, of organ donation is quite rare, meaning the possibility in which people pass away in a condition in which their organs are healthy enough and retrievable enough doesn't happen every day. The vast majority of deaths do not make that possible. It could be that as science develops and changes, it'll be more and more possible. But for the vast majority of people, this is not a possibility. Now, it used to be thought that this is a young man's, game, so to speak, right? That only like 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, motorcycle accidents, whatever it might be, can donate organs, but it can't be done as people get older. This is factually not true anymore. This is partly because of science, but also partly because of evolving understanding of the body, in which transplant doctors understood that many people, even as they're older, have perfectly healthy organs that can be transplanted into someone, sometimes their own age, sometimes younger. So I remember I was speaking about this in the Young Israel of Hillcrest. I don't remember what I think it was actually a year ago, almost a year ago today. And I was there in Motzei Shabbat. I mentioned Derech Agav, this phenomenon. And someone who was in the room who works for something called Live On New York, the organ procurement organization in New York City. And he told me that last week, last week, they just retrieved the liver from a 92-year-old woman. Right? So that's pretty remarkable. And of course, my response is, you retrieved a liver from a 92-year-old. She must have never gone to Kiddush Club. And that was a very Jewish response to a really remarkable phenomenon. And so, yes, it's definitely true. But as people get older and their health journeys take them in different places, it's not always possible anymore. And the cause of death and the way people die also doesn't make it possible. And we'll get into this a little bit more as we go along. The issue, but when it comes up, and this is the point which is critical, is that when it is possible, it can literally save lives. And it is an amazing phenomenon. And so that's why, while the topic doesn't come up every day, it is something which, when it is possible, is really a big decision and a big issue. It's come up recently with a greater amount of attention because of certain events in the state of Israel. Of course, as we all know, and as Audrey mentioned beforehand, we are counting our blessings for 4 lives that were saved yesterday. Of course, we lost a life as well in the process, a soldier, but really remarkable and very thankful for that. And in the course of this war, 11 soldiers have died in manners in which they were able to donate. All of them agreed to donate, or they had signed an organ donor card beforehand. And from these 11 soldiers, 48 lives have been saved. And that's a tremendous number of Israeli lives who've been saved from this. And as you can see from the pictures, you see that it's different. You have Ethiopians, you have Russians, you have Ashkenazim, you have Sephardim, you have Datiim, you have Mesortim, you have Chilonim. It's really been quite remarkable. The man on the top right, Ranan Eshkar, had actually donated a kidney altruistically 4 months beforehand. 4 months he died in action. And then his wife, for her, was like a no-brainer. Of course, we'll do this. And everyone here has a story. Dor Zimmel was supposed to be married yesterday. The man on the bottom right. His wedding was set for yesterday. Unfortunately, he passed away. I think it was a month or two ago. He's still in action. And his lungs were actually donated to another soldier who had been wounded in Gaza, and they just couldn't get his lungs healthier and better. And his lungs, so Dor Zimmel died saving his fellow soldiers, and then both in life and death saved lives. So it's been truly, pretty remarkable. And each person here has a different story. We've tried to feature them a bit on the Amitai website. Each one has really interesting, story and situation, and background, and decision. It's been very inspiring in a lot of ways. And so it's raised attention to the issue once again of organ donation. You may also recall Lucy D. Lucy D. Zechon Lebracha was killed last Pesach along with her 2 daughters. So her 2 daughters died on the spot. Lucy was taken to the hospital and was declared dead in the hospital after she being connected to a ventilator. This is a critical point. If you're killed in action and you die on the spot there, right? So if you're not being connected to anything that can keep your organs vital, it's not going to be possible to do organ donation. But Lucy D remained alive until she got to the hospital, and her husband, Rabbi Leo D, after asking a shaila, decided to donate her organs, and 5 lives were saved from that. So this has raised attention, of course, to the issue of organ donation and re-raised a lot of issues. And what we're going to try to do today is discuss some of the issues that come up. And like I said beforehand, this became a very controversial issue in the frum community. It got very heated sometimes, and to the point where sometimes people didn't want to talk about it. Like, it doesn't come up that often. Every time we discuss it, people start arguing. And I think, as I said to Audrey and Menachem, like, we can have a normal, calm conversation about something. Like, we should be mature adults about this, and sort of discuss, the issues at hand and explain the different shitot, and that's it. That's what we're going to try to do today. Nothing more, nothing less. So let's try to explore the issue as it unfolds in the halachic literature in a non-polemical way. And I'll explain a little bit why as we go along, why I think it became, sort of heated, although I actually don't fully get why, but we'll discuss as we go along. Okay, so this man, his name is Dr. Christian Barnard, who was in South Africa in 1968. Organ transplantation had been going on since 1954, but he was the first to transplant a heart. And it was with a great celebration, a little bit of controversy as well. And one of the controversies that sort of came up in his case was the really obvious question, which is as follows. We have the technology to retrieve organs while they are still vital. But at what point do we say that we're allowed to take those organs? Because at some point you'd say, well, yeah, the organs are vital, but that's a live person. So, for example, if someone's coming to me and say to me, Shlomo, don't you realize you could save up to 8 lives? So would you mind if we take your organs? And the answer, of course, would be, yes, I wouldn't mind, right? In other words, this is a legitimate, right? It's only a legitimate when you're coming to take from a dead patient, someone who's deceased. But if you're taking the heart and other organs from someone who's alive, this is a violation of what is known as the dead donor rule. And so one of the big debates emerged is, well, when exactly do we say that a person has died? Now, you might say, well, that's simple. We all know when someone's dead, but it's actually not so simple. I mean, let's think about it. Any organism has a certain amount of decay in their functioning as they near the time of death. We all agree, for example, that death is when a organism, a human, can be something else, starts to decompose. Everyone understands there's no vitality there. The person is going to decompose. And yet, I think that all of us understand, whether it's humans or others, we don't wait to see decomposition in order to say that someone has passed away. And so the question becomes is, at what point along the process do we say that, this person is, or organism, a person is no longer alive? So you could say, for example, I don't think anyone says this in practice, but you could say someone with a severe brain injury, someone with a, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. I hope I'm getting over a cold, have a cold, but someone who is severe brain injury, someone who has a persistent vegetative state for many years, right? You could say, maybe that person is not alive. But then you look at the body and say, well, wait a minute. How can you say that person's not alive? The heart is still beating on its own. The person's still breathing. And all sorts of other functioning. Of course, they're still alive. Right? And so the question becomes is, at what point do you say along the lines of dysfunctioning, this is the point in which we draw the line? And this actually is not a question, that science can answer. What I mean by that is as follows. Science can tell us the process of dysfunction and how that moves along. It can tell us when a person has stopped breathing, tells them if a person's heart has stopped functioning, when their kidneys have stopped functioning, when the brain is seriously damaged, whatever it might be. But it is ultimately a cultural, a legal, a religious, an ethical decision where you draw that line. And that indeed actually is not really a matter of dispute. So if you look in two writings here of two very prominent Jewish bioethicists who have very different perspectives on the issue of hospice organ donation. On the left, Rabbi Dr. J. David Bleich. On the right, Rabbi Professor Avram Steinberg. Both of them tell us a definition of death, we'll see from Rabbi Bleich, cannot be derived from medical facts or scientific investigation alone. The physician only describes the physiological state which he observes, whether the patient meeting that description is alive or dead, whether the human organism in that physiological state is to be treated as a living person or as a corpse, is an ethical and legal question. The determination of the time of death, insofar as it is more than a mere exercise in semantics, is essentially a theological and moral problem, not a medical or scientific one. Right? And Rabbi Steinberg says something similar. Death on a biological level is a progressive process in which various cells, tissues, and organs die at different times, depending on their sensitivity to the absence of oxygen and energy sources. The determination of the exact moment of death depends on social, philosophical, legal, and religion acceptance of specific criteria, even if some cells or parts in the body are still biologically alive. So just to make the clear point, I'm happy to see that Rabbi Steinberg spoke in Silver Spring at Shabbos. That's wonderful. Okay, very good. He's a member of Amitab's Rabbinic Advisory Board. Wonderful man. So let's just make the point, which Rabbi Steinberg points out often, which is as follows. When a person is buried, you go to a funeral today, right? There are still cellular activity going on in their body. Does that mean we're burying them alive? No, chas v'shalom. Right? It doesn't mean just because there's still some cellular activity going on and there's some cellular vitality, doesn't mean that we consider that person to be alive. So everyone agrees we're not waiting to decomposition. And if that is the case, the question becomes is, when do you draw this lie. Okay, and so this is really one of the things that we're going to have to be thinking about, particularly because we know that halacha recognizes this concept of death, meaning the biggest nafkamina, or again the issues of organ donation, the biggest nafkamina, the biggest implication of death relates to tuma and tahara, purity and impurity. And the Mishnah Olo tells us, Adam enu metame nafsho, right? And there's a person, even if they're cut up, or even they're about to die, they're gosses, it doesn't matter. They're not halachically dead, and therefore not metame until they're actually dead. And then it goes on to say something very interesting, and this is actually talking about animals, a similar idea of animals, but it says, Hutzu rosheam, even if their heads have been cut off, right? And so when you cut off an animal's heads, and as we'll discuss a little bit, this might be true with humans as well, you're still going to see shemifar chasim, right? That they are still moving convulsively, right? They have some form of excuse me, they're still moving like a lizard's tail. It doesn't matter. They're considered to be dead because after all, they've been beheaded. So you have a very interesting statement in the Mishnah Olo, which tells us the following. It tells us that a person is not matam until they're dead, but there are situations where you might have reflexes, right? Like a lizard's tail, if you call it a lizard's tail, still be shaking around, moving convulsively, but that doesn't mean they're alive after all they've been beheaded. Now, this has not always been a perfect process of knowing when someone is dead. So the Mishnah Svelchas tells us that they used to have a minhag that up till 3 days they would go and check to make sure that people weren't being buried alive. And they even have this crazy story where they once came about and they found that a man was alive. So, of course, they saved him. He lived for another 25 years and had 5 children to boot. Okay, so these stories can exist. And in fact, lest you say, oh, that only would happen in yesteryear. So here is the headline on the right from the New York Times, June 3rd, 2024, 10 days ago, my friends. A woman was declared dead, is found alive at a funeral home. Okay, and you can read the story here about a woman who was declared dead, and a similar incident happened in Long Island last year, in Iowa another year. And yeah, it happens every now and then. And the truth is that you should not worry about this, friends. This is not a common occurrence, of course, right? But the phenomenon I'm trying to tell you does exist. And this was always a question, which is when do you draw the line? So if you look back on the page beforehand, you'll see here in the Ramah, very interesting question. Let's say, chas v'shalom, a woman dies in labor. So what do? Even if it's Shabbos, doesn't matter, right? We immediately do an emergency C-section, which includes certain malachot, in order to save the fetus. But the Ramah then goes and says, well, we don't do this today, whether it's Shabbos or Chol, because we're not always so sure when the woman is dead. Meaning, we don't want to do something that will cause the woman to die. And even though that means that we might not be able to save the fetus, but we're not going to do something to cause the woman to die. And so this issue wasn't always a perfect process, but poskim have said throughout one form or another, right, we don't worry about these crazy phenomena, these situations. We declare a person to be dead, and we don't stay awake worrying about this. The Chidah, as David Azulat, has a very interesting statement where he says, listen, if in one of many tens of thousands of cases it happens that he is alive, there's no Avera here, and we assume that even though the person is buried alive, it must be their Chayev Mita anyway, and they should have been killed anyway. As I've told people before, you can see why the Chidah never made it as a pulpit rabbi. But nonetheless, right, you see the point. What you're saying is that this fear, which has existed for some time, is not something which is going to should bother us too much. Now, that doesn't mean it hasn't bothered people over the years. Of course, today we have modern medicine. It's a lot easier. So in the 19th century, this actually becomes a huge issue. In the late 18th, early 19th century, Europe as a whole had this general fear of burying people alive. And all the magazines and newspapers contain stories of this. And to the point where, have you ever heard the expression saved by the bell? So we usually think of Saved by the Bell as being like you're about to get detention in school, and your teacher's really angry. And what happens? You get saved by the bell, right? And you get out of class, right? And I think there's a TV show along those lines, whoever it might be. I'm dating myself here, right? So whatever it is, right? So that's how we used to think about it. Well, the term Saved by the Bell actually comes from a different place. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as this fear gripped Europe, they created a practice. And the practice was that when they would bury someone, they would bury them holding a string in their hand, wrapped around their hand, that would be attached to a bell that was above ground. So that way, if they wake up 6 feet under, they can still ring the bell and they would be saved by the bell. Okay, I don't know if this ruins the TV show for you or helps you with the TV show or the expression, whatever it might be, but this is the fear that gripped Europe. And we're actually going to see it leads to a very, very important halachic discussion as well because of that. But we'll come back to that as we go along. Okay, so this is an idea out there which you have to figure out, right? But of course, then what was the issues? They were afraid that person had fainted and somehow wasn't showing any signs of life. And, at some point, like there should be ways of figuring this out, of course, right? And indeed, this wasn't like a thing that's going on throughout the ages. And so there were ways of testing. And what's important right now, of course, today we have very scientific, technological ways of testing for a heartbeat and a pulse and breathing, this and that, whatever it might be. But back then, what did they do? So the Gemara tells us what they did. And the Gemara talks about this precisely in these types of cases. And the Gemara in Yuma, well-known Gemara, Yuma tells us as follows, very sad case. A person has been caught underneath an avalanche of stones under Shabbat. And we need to decide, well, how far do we go? Of course, for Safek Pikuach Nefesh. Let alone Pikuach Nefesh. Even there's a doubt, we violate Shabbat in order to save someone's life. So we have a Safek that the person is alive or dead, they're there or not, whatever it might be. And we go and say, okay, let's keep on moving the rocks. And then we find the body and we start checking. And what the Gemara tells us, and this is certainly the conclusion of the Gemara, is as follows. If you find the body, as Rashi says, the person Eino Maziz Everav, right? Where do you check to? Ad Heichan Umefakeach Ladat Hamet, right? Now you know. And the Gemara tells us in the end, we check until the nose. Why the nose? Well, Abba Shaul tells us because this is the pasuk in Breshit. Kol asher nishma ruach hayim ve'apav, his nostrils. So we check the nose. The nose is where we check the person for the breath of life, and this is brought down la halacha as well. This used to be known as the feather. As the feather test. So if you're not sure, you put up a piece of paper or feather, whatever it might be, up to someone's nose, and you'd see if there's any form of movement. That'd be an indication that they are still breathing. Okay, so this is brought down the halacha. And it's interesting, actually, the formulation of the Shulchan Aruch Harav is very important here. The Shulchan Aruch Harav was the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, of course, Baal Tanya, very, very influential in general, but particularly in the Chabad movement. And we'll look at his formulation. Afapiken Bolkin ad chotmo, he checked to his nostril, ki ikar heker chiyutu b'chotem, because the key sign of life is in the nostril, shenamar kol asher nishma ruach hayim be'apa. Now, what do we get from this Gemara? It is clear that when there's doubt, we have no signs of life. So what do we check? We do a test. We check from breathing in the nostrils. But here is the big question. Is the fact that we now say that we test through the nostrils also an indication that the criteria for what it means to be alive or dead is respiration? Because you could say what we're doing in this Gemara is just telling us if there's no signs of life, of activity, then what do? We're not sure. So what do? We check the nose, we do the feather test. But it's not a broader statement. And if we see signs of life, of course, we'll treat the person as alive. But you could say, especially based on the pasuk, right? That this wasn't just a test. There's a rationale behind the test. And the rationale is, Kol Hashem Nishma Ruach Chaim Be'apav, as the Balatani says, Ikar Chiyut. The sign, the key test of life, is from respiration. Now, why does this get so critical? So here came the great debate over what was colloquially known as brain death, but it's actually a very confusing term, okay? Because what we actually care about in brain death is what actually is known as the brain stem, the area in the lower part of the head, right, lower part of the brain area, in which controls many different functionings from the nervous system down, sends through the brain stem, including the ability for respiration. Okay, now here becomes the question. So if the brain stem has stopped functioning, then does that mean we have a situation of the irreversible cessation of respiration? That is to mean that a person is not responsive to their environment at all. Criteria number one, as we saw in the Gemara based on Rashi. And two, they have the irreversible cessation of spontaneous respiration. They will never, ever again be able to breathe on their own. Okay? This is different from a coma. This is different from a vegetative state. In a coma, vegetative state, people are sometimes connected to a ventilator in order to help them breathe. But if you took the ventilator off, they'd still be able to breathe on their own. But the test of brain stem death is really much a test of that we check neurologically in the head to see what's going on in the lungs. Does this mean that we have a criteria of death being established by the Gemara? And here's the nafkamina, because here comes the question. When you have brain death, you have a very, very interesting phenomenon. In fact, by the way, just to be clear, in Israel, they don't call it brain stem death or brain death. They call it respiratory brain death. And the reason why they emphasize it, the respiratory part, is because they're trying to stress that what we actually care about is the irreversible cessation of respiration. Okay? This gets confusing in places like America or England, where sometimes they call it brain death or whole brain death. And there's no doubt that in the brain, when a person has irreversible cessation of respiration, there might still be activity, cellular activity, other activity going on in the brain, not consciousness, but other forms of activity that, for example, might regulate the temperature of the body and other types of things. But the question is, we don't care about the whole brain. We care about the brain stem, and in particular, the control of the respiration. So in the United States right now, there is an attempt to try to sharpen the definition of death, because they want to clarify we don't care about the whole brain. We care about the functionality of the brain vis-a-vis really the brain stem. And unfortunately, because of all the politics of American society, the committee had to sort of disengage from the issue without actually being able to do anything, because they felt they couldn't touch the definition of death without launching a political, cable news sort of avalanche of misinformation, which is a sad, sad statement about American society and politics. Just putting it out there right now. In any case, but I really don't want to talk about American politics. When I was offered once to talk about American politics or a root canal, I choose the root canal. Okay, so that's how I think about these issues. Unfortunately for me, my doctor here in Israel is an American Oleh. My dentist is American Oleh, who's not only a good dentist, but also a real politics buff who really likes talking about politics and having on cable news. And as you know, with dentists, they can just keep on talking and you can't respond. Right? It's like a soliloquy. I hope I haven't insulted too many dentists on this call right now, but it's an amazing phenomenon. So my root canals haven't solved this problem. But in any case, I've gone off beat. I've gone off track here. So getting back to our topic, right? So the issue is respiratory brain death, the definition of death. And here's what happens in brain death. A person's not responsive to their environment. Okay? They're not responsive to their environment, which means we do all sorts of tests on the body. It used to be called the doll test. It's not really a great test, but way of referring to it. But we'll do all sorts of tests to see, can they react at all? So we'll shoot cold water into the ears. We'll put flashlights into the eyes. We'll shake the head all sorts of ways, which if you did that to a patient who's in a coma or vegetative state, they show some form of response. So that's one type of test that we do. The second test that we do is something called an apnea exam. An apnea exam is a test in which we give a person a lot of air, and then we remove them and see, are they able to push it out? Because if they're able to breathe on their own, they'd have to push out that air. Okay, so that's how we test. And in Israel, and in some places around the United States, many places around the United States as well, and other places around the world, they've also added another test to check for cranial blood flow, to make sure that there's no blood in that, because they see there's a lack of blood flow, then they can see, the brain has been disconnected in this way, and that's how you really know that the brain stem has stopped functioning. Okay, so, but while this is all happening, the person is having their heart still beating. Body is warm. They can even get a temperature. They can even show signs of sweating. Okay? And the question then becomes is, well, do we think of this person as alive or dead? Now, the reason why their heart is still beating, right, and they're still having air come in and out is because we're artificially keeping the heart going through the help of a ventilator and other mechanisms. I purposely call it a ventilator and not life support. Because if I call it life support, of course, that's biasing the whole conversation. Right? So sometimes, of course, when you're going for surgery, you need a ventilator. That is life support. But here the question is, you're just ventilating. Is the body alive or dead? And this comes to the big question, do we consider the irreversible cessation of spontaneous respiration? You'll never, ever, ever again be able to breathe on your own and not responsive to your environment to be the criteria for death. So in the Western world and beyond, they've accepted this notion of brain stem death as being the legal criteria for death. And even though there are those in the ethical world and medical world, not many, but there are certainly those who don't agree with that definition, they've decided to draw the line. As I said, it's not a scientific determination. It's a legal or ethical determination based on using scientific information where you're going to draw the line. The question becomes is, does Judaism accept this? Nafka mina, can you donate organs? Because here's the amazing thing. At the point of respiratory brain death, while we can maintain the body with some form of support, keep the organs vital, those organs can still be vital enough in order then to be transplanted in someone else's body. So let's take a classic case that comes up. Someone have a tragic brain aneurysm, and they will be declared brainstem death in the hospital. They're connected to a ventilator, but you can have this with someone quite young. Right? I mean, we just had, not far from where I live, we had someone who choked on a piece of steak at a restaurant. Terrible, terrible situation, right? And they couldn't dislodge it, right? But he was a young person. His organs were very, very, very healthy. So at that point, while we're still maintaining support for the organs, the question becomes, do we declare that person dead, allowing the retrieval of the organs to save someone else's life? But we're only going to allow that if we consider the person to be dead. So here was the great halachic debate. And here you see, remember, the Khatam Sofer was very involved in the beginning of the 19th century in this Saved by the Bell, right, fight. And he says, and excuse me, there's a situation in Europe where the local authorities didn't want to allow Jews and others to be buried until they started signs of discoloration of the body, until there were signs of decomposition. The Khatam Sofer says that is absolutely forbidden. The Salamat Metim is delaying burial. We have a way of determining death. There's no doubt that when the Torah says, thou shalt not let his body lay buried overnight, lo talin, bal talin, right? This is a clear thing. We had a way to establish death. And maybe we got that originally from the early scientists, or maybe we had a Masorah from Torah Shabbal Peh, whatever it might be, or maybe relied on the Pasuk, Kol Asher Nishmat Ruach Chaim Be'apah, as declared in the Gemara in Yoma. And on this basis of this statement of the Khatam Sofer, and in general, this idea that was brought down in Shulchan Aruch, that we care about breathing, Rav Moshe Feinstein released a tshuva in 1976. I want to explain a little bit of the background of this tshuva because it became controversial, as I mentioned. It was a tshuva that was later published in his tshuva called Igrot Moshe. but was initially disseminated to the Raphael Society of the Association of Orthodox Jewish Scientists, which was headed at the time, or one of the leaders of it at the time, was his son-in-law, Rabbi Dr. Moshe David Tendler. And Rabbi Moshe releases a tshuva, a one-page tshuva in Hebrew, which is sent out publicly to the 1,000+ members of the AOJS with a 4.5-page explanation by Rabbi Tendler in English, in which Rabbi Moshe says, right, the criteria for death is ability or inability to breathe. The fact that the ventilator inflates the lungs is irrelevant. This is not the type of sign of life that we care when it comes to respiration. On this basis, Rabbi Tendler publicly said, and then Paskin, that brainstem death is the halachic criteria for death. This allows Jews to donate organs on his largely under this influence. The chief rabbi of Israel in 1986, 10 years later, publicly accepts brainstem death as the halachic criteria for death, and this allows for the popularization of organ donation in the state of Israel, even amongst the religious population and with religious doctors. But you could say, wait a minute, this isn't actually what the Gemara was telling us. The Gemara just told us the following. When you don't see any signs of life, what do? You check the nose. But if there are other signs of life, like, for example, the heart is still beating, the body is still warm, they're not dead. I think one of the clearest statements of this was by one of the prominent poskim in Bnei Brak today, Rav Zilberstein, the son-in-law of Rav Elyashiv Zatzal, who says very clearly, yes, it is true, of course. Right? We care about breathing. We still have the feather test, but that doesn't mean that breathing is the definition of life. It just means that breathing is a sign of life. Right? But if there are other signs that a person is alive, we cannot say that the person has indeed died. And indeed, he and others cite the end of that tshuva, the Chatam Sofer. The Chatam Sofer keeps on saying throughout, listen, respiration. And he ends the tshuva and says, if any person, after lying still like a motionless stone and has no pulsations, and if after that his respiration ceases, we have to rely on the words of our holy Torah that the person is dead. What did he add here? Not just as respiration ceases, but also is not gotten a pulse. And so some say the Chatam Sofer was actually acknowledging that the person has a pulse. Right? If there's going to be signs of life, the heart continues to breathe. Heart continues to breathe. If the heart continues to pump, therefore the person is alive. And there's a lot of ink spilled on this, but I think this is the crux of the debate. Do you see the feather test as a criterion for death, as the tshuva of Rav Moshe indicates? Or do you see this as just a sign when we test a person for when there's no other sign of life, but there's other signs of life, the person's still alive? Okay. Now, after Rav Moshe releases this tshuva, after Rabbi Tendler publicizes this tshuva, so there's a whole brouhaha about it. Partly because 8 years earlier, Rav Moshe had written on the topic, and in a tshuva with the Minchas Yitzchak and others, he seems to say, like the Tzitz Eliezer and others, that this whole notion, what they did in South Africa, was double murder, because it was too experimental. So even for the recipient, it was killing him, and it was certainly killing the donor. And so 8 years later, he changes his mind, and many poskim say, like, I can't believe he changed his mind. Like, there's still an ongoing debate in 1976 in the medical community, and certainly in the world of poskim, for him to write this way. And so various figures, particularly towards the end of Rav Moshe's life, which is significant, question whether this was actually his opinion. There was also a tshuva in 1978, which is written, in which Rav Moshe writes to a figure in Israel, and he says, no, this isn't death, but that was clearly a case actually of not being a brain death case. So I'm not sure that's so relevant, but whatever it might be, this is the one tshuva that is very significant. He then gets to the point where there's other letters that are written when Moshe is quite ill and towards the end of his life, which are written by his assistants, his grandchildren, who, according to people, Vitello and others, were loyally dictating his words. According to others, were not so loyally dictating his words, and so on and so forth. So it became a very spicy topic. I'm actually personally totally convinced that this was Moshe's opinion. For the following reason. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says, how could Moshe have written this? There's still an ongoing debate. The answer is he had one chief medical advisor. That chief medical advisor was his son-in-law, and the son-in-law was a pioneer in this field and trying to promote this idea. Right? So, you can question whether you think Moshe should have other medical advisors. But that was Moshe's decision. And if you go to our website, you can see links to the testimony from from a son, a son-in-law, from grandchildren, and from 3 or 4 doctors who affirmed that they spoke to Rav Moshe personally about this issue, and Rav Moshe said that this is his opinion. But other poskim certainly didn't accept this, and Tzitz Eliezer didn't accept this, and Minchas Yitzchak didn't accept it, and so on and so forth. So where did we land on this issue? So, as I said, first of all, it became very contentious. People got a little bit heated, got a little personal, whatever it might be. But here's where we are today. In the religious Zionist community in Israel, there is no religious Zionist posek who lives in Israel who doesn't accept brainstem death and organ donation. Okay, let me explain to you how remarkable this is. You can see here a letter that was written in 2011. This was after a whole phenomenon where they created a whole protocol in the hospitals, partly in the influence of Professor Steinberg, who's mentioned earlier, Professor Steinberg earlier, and to make sure that there's proper testing done. And this is the only issue that religious Zionist poskim in Israel actually agree upon. Okay, I want to stress to you how remarkable this is. So religious Zionist poskim in Israel don't agree about kashrut standards. Okay? They don't agree about gerus standards, conversion standards. They don't agree about women's issues. They don't agree about land for peace. They don't agree about the status of. They don't agree about what bracha you say on bamba. Hey, bramba is the national food. You think if there's one thing we could come to consensus on, it'd be what bracha you say on bamba. And no, that's also machlokas. Right? Maybe it's shakol, maybe it's adama, whatever it might be. The one issue that religious Zionist posts can agree upon, young and old, Rav Yatzer Rimon, Rav Yaakov Ariel, Shmuel Eliyahu, etc., is they accept brain death, brain stem death, or respiratory brain death. That's a halachic criteria for death, and allow for organ donation. A remarkable phenomenon. I have a whole theory about why this is, but leave it aside right now. That is the consensus position of religious Zionist poskim here in Israel. In the Haredi world in Israel, as a matter of practice, Haredim do not accept brain stem death and therefore will not donate. It's a little bit complicated because there are certain poskim alive today in the Haredi world who do accept it. The most prominent of which is Rav Shlomo Amar, former Sephardic chief rabbi, now chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, who is a firm believer in brainstem death and organ donation. And there are others, right? But I don't want to get into all the issues here because there's a whole discussion what exactly Rav Ovadia Yosef say, what exactly did Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach say towards the end of their lives, and there's a lot of debate and fights about that as well. But in practice, based on this letter of others of Rav Shlomo Zalman, of Yosef Zatzal, towards the end of the life, they said if the heart is still beating, this is safek shvichus damim, and if it is a safek, we cannot allow for organs to be retrieved. And so in practice, despite all the fights about what exactly Rav Shlomo Zalman really felt at the end, and Rav Ovadia, in practice, the Haredi world in Israel does not donate. In America, Canada, and England, it became a very big fight, partly over the debate over what exactly was the position of Rav Moshe, and also debate about what was the position of Rav Soloveitchik itself. I don't want to get into all the back and forth here on the different positions. I have feelings on this issue. But I didn't talk to any of these great Gedolim about it, so I can only tell you my own research says and indicates, and it is what it is. This is the reality on the ground. Right now, it is interesting that what has happened is actually a very interesting phenomenon. In England, in Israel, in South Africa, and in Australia, those are 4 places where you have a centralized rabbinate. So the rabbinate, in one form or another, has facilitated people to do halachic organ donation. And they say, if you, your Rav, whatever it might be, decide to accept brain death, we will help certify this and make sure all the tests are done. So this was set up by Dayan Ullman, one of the important Chabad poskim. It's also just a prominent posting in general. It's Av Bezdin in Sydney. And this was what the Bezdin in Johannesburg did. And the chief rabbinate, office of the chief rabbinate in England set up this system. England has a very interesting organ donation system. In America and in Canada and in Israel, you have to opt in. You have to choose to be an organ donor. In England and much of Europe now, actually, you have to opt out. The default is you're going to be an organ donor. And therefore, when they changed the law, Rabbi Mervis, Chief Rabbi Mervis, went to the NHS and healthcare system and set up a system where people can remain opt in, but say, I only want organs to be retrieved if a member of my clergy has been consulted first to approve of it. This applies to other faiths as well. And by doing so, he sort of left the door open for saying, okay, well, if you have rabbinic approval for it, then your rabbi will supervise this and whatnot. And the same thing is true in Israel. In Israel, in a letter that was written by Rav Shlomo Amar and then signed by Rav Ovadia Yosef, right, which is how the law got passed, because Shas was support for the law needed to be passed. This protocol was set up in Israel, which allows for very strict testing for brain death. And once that is achieved, then a person can choose to have their organs donated. Okay, and Rav Ovadia signed the letter, and then 2 days later, passed in Lamaisa in a specific case that they came to him and allowed the organ donation. But like I said, things got a little Labor Dick about if I didn't mean it. I don't know. I may or may not have heard the conversation in which Rav Shlomo Amar and Rav Yosef discussed this issue with at the time head of Shas, Eli Ishai, and I may or may not have heard the recording of this in which he says very clearly this is psak halacha, and I may or may not have heard him say, I think this is mutter and you can do this. But I may or may not want to get into the issue of all the fights about what Rav Yosef said. So I won't get further into that issue. And that, my friends, is where we are at on this issue. Right? In Israel, you have sort of clear lines. It's crazy. It doesn't have to be a religious Zionist versus Haredi issue. This is not like going to the army, right? There's no reason per se it should be that way. But in practice, that's how it's come down to be. And in America, Canada, and England, it just became a very, very big and heated fight. And it doesn't come up every day. I mean, here's one of the remarkable phenomena. It became like this big dispute, and various rabbinic organizations, they had huge conventions. We got very heated over it, and different Rosh Hashiva wouldn't talk to each other. And Lamaisa, though, I mean, I'll be actually very curious of the people on this call alone. I don't mean there's one person here who's in the organ donation business, all right, so he does that. But besides him, I'm actually curious if anyone here, I'd be happy if you write to me privately or chat, whatever it might be, knows of someone who was declared brain dead and had the opportunity for donating organs, let alone donated the organs. Very rarely does it come up. And so when it comes up, of course, so it's a big deal because you can save up to 8 lives. As we saw at the beginning, these 11 soldiers alone have saved 48 lives. Now, the issue that still needs to be discussed is that people sometimes say to me the following, well, wait a minute, you're only focusing on the time of death. Why is time of death the only issue? After all, we have other issues to be concerned about. And so I want to try to briefly show you is that the other issues aren't real issues. So some people are nervous about an ayin hara. If you sign a card, you express your wishes that when I die, I should donate my organs. This is an ayin hara. In fact, the Israeli donor card, there's a whole fight. How should the Israeli donor card be written in order to avoid the chashash ayin hara? So I don't know if any of you have signed a ktuba, many of you are married. I presume one or two of you are married, and you might know that your ketubah is a divorce document, right? I'm sure some of you have bought life insurance or car insurance or fire insurance, and I don't think any of us think that brings upon an ayin hara. I'm sure many of us have bought kip kavarim, where we want to be buried. I don't think any of us think that's an ayin hara. So the ayin hara issue is not really a big issue. The issue that sometimes comes up, this actually came up not long ago, very tragic case, a 3-year-old, pool drowning, I don't remember exactly what the circumstances was declared brain dead, and the Rav that was consulting with me said to me, the mom is concerned about tchiyat hameitim, because how will the organs come back? And, obviously that's a very emotionally difficult situation, of course, very, very difficult, very, very sad, difficult situation. But as I point out to the Rav, all organs decompose when we're buried, whether or not you've donated them beforehand or not. And so the Ribono Shel Olam, who has the power to do tchiyat hameitim, also has the power to bring back organs, whether they've been decomposed or been donated to someone else. And as I even said to him, and no one suggests that those that are cremated in the Holocaust won't come back in tchiyat hameitim. But this issue does come up every now and then. People are concerned about this. The other issue, I call this the set of surmountable issues. So you have the beliefs that are ayin haras, tchiyat hameitim are superstitions, but that there's a superstition that these beliefs include a barrier to organ donations. And true emotions, of course, is very difficult. If you haven't been educated about the topic beforehand, if you haven't declared to your family what you want. So, I've had cases where, someone dies tragically, suddenly in a car accident. The family's life has been totally turned upside down, topsy-turvy. And now all of a sudden someone says, we're going to declare the person dead and want you to give their organs. That's obviously very difficult, but it's one of those issues. That's why education is so important. And then you get to the triad of taboos, or the triad of 3 isurim, because we care very much, my friends, about kavod hamet. And that means that we don't desecrate the met. We don't do nivul hamet. We don't delay burial, unnecessary delay burial, halavat metim, and we try not to derive benefit. Enough. The 3 isurim, the 3 taboos. And so people sometimes bring up this issue. So I'll give you an example. I mean, this is culturally speaking, very powerful. So when it comes to halavat metim, I just want to explain the following. Organ donation, actually, retrieval, doesn't take a whole long of time. And so, in Yerushalayim, sometimes they'll bury someone within 6 hours, 12 hours, whatever it might be. But certainly in Chutz La'aretz, you take a day or two, right, for a spading to be prepared, for family to come in, whatever it might be. Organ donation can be done within organ retrieval can be done in 6, 12, 24 hours, whatever it might be. This is not going to delay the burial, overly delay the burial. The issue of nivul hamet and hanat hamet is more serious, but without getting to the issues, first of all, in terms of nivul hamet, this isn't like people have this image like they're grabbing organs. Like this is a very dignified procedure in which they're doing cutting open the body, but for the sake of retrieving organ, and they stitch up the body again. So people sometimes ask me, if I'm an organ donor, it will be a problem doing a tahara. No, there's no problem doing tahara. The body is kept, the corpse is kept in a very dignified manner. And ultimately, all of these potential isurim are pushed aside because of pikuach nefesh. Right? Pikuach nefesh is docha all of these potential isurim. So whether or not you think this is a hana or halana metim or nivul hamet, you could argue about this. Even if you think this is all true, nonetheless, all of those issues can get pushed aside because of the phenomenon of pikuach nefesh, docha all the mitzvot, and therefore, I don't think these are really serious halachic issues. But on a cultural level, they present all sorts of issues. So I'll tell you a story one of my colleagues had once, not from person, and it was a very sad case. Many of these cases are very sad cases. And the patient's brother says to my colleague and says, listen, Jews don't donate organs. We have to be buried whole. We call bodily integrity. And this rabbi says, listen, I'm telling you, and not everyone agrees to this, but the patient's brother was accepting brain death. So his barrier wasn't the brain death issue. The barrier in his case was the issue of nivul hamet, bodily integrity. And so the rabbi says to him, why are you so sure? And so he says, listen, my grandfather had his bottom part of his leg amputated. And for 10 years, we kept it in our freezer until he died and buried it with him. So I know, Rabbi, that Jews have to be buried whole. Now, that's a crazy story on so many different levels. And as you can imagine, the rabbi sort of said, all right, well, I'm not going to convince this guy otherwise. Just so you should know, amputated, like from a live person, just be buried, doesn't have to be preserved in that way. It might not even need to be buried at all. And certainly, like I said before, and this is not a barrier to pikuach nefesh. So the real issue here is just pikuach nefesh. And excuse me, the real issue is just the time of death. And that is going to be, an ongoing discussion in the halacha community. The one last thing I want to raise, and then I'll take questions, is the following. If you don't accept brain death, and you think that this patient is still alive, well, then can you receive organs? Because let's think about it. How does organ donation work? If you have organ failure, you put yourself on an organ transplant recipient list, and you are waiting, hoping for that call. And someone calls and says, there's an organ here for you. But if you think that person is still technically alive, well, aren't you actually then causing the killing of that donor in order to save yourself? So would this be a violation of the dead donor rule? So here, as you can see, this you can imagine, this becomes a very sensitive issue, because let's think about it for a moment. Essentially, it comes down to, what are you saying? Jews, if you don't accept brain death, will be takers, but not givers. And that's a very loaded connotation to that. So this was a bit of part of why this became so contentious. And you can see here the writings of Rabbi Breitowitz, as I'm sure many of you know Rabbi Breitowitz well, very big Talmid Chacham, very smart man, who, when he wrote about this issue, says, listen, at the end of the day, you're not going to cause the person to die, because they're going to declare him dead anyway. And there's if this person accepts brain death. And so you're not the causative factor, the gorem, in the termination of life. And the fact that this might have been sinful is irrelevant. Once he's dead, he's dead. Rabbi Tendler absolutely hated this idea. Rabbi Tendler was very adamant. If you don't accept brain death, you can't receive organs either. Because at the end of the day, the doctor is going to do the organ retrieval on your behalf. And your insurance is going to pay for this surgery to be done on this patient who you consider to be alive. How can you do such a thing? Okay? So this is one of the issues that became very, 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 very sensitive. Interestingly enough, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach had a very unique position in which he said that in Eretz Yisrael, you cannot be even a recipient from a brain dead patient. Because he said in Eretz Yisrael, we have control, we have influence on the society. And so we should just say, if we don't accept brain death, we should be a part of this whole system. We should be against this whole system entirely. In Chutz La'aretz, we have very little control, very small part of the population. It's not such an issue. But in practice, following a psak of Rabbi Yoshev, the Oilam in Israel ignores Rosh Hashanah's shita on this issue and accepts, even as they don't receive. You can see here from Rabbi Carmel from Eretz Chemda, following lead Rabbi Tendler, felt this was a horrible Chilul Hashem, this whole idea of taking but not giving. And I think that was one of the issues that sort of helped make things pretty labordic on this issue. But like I said to you, there's going to be Edu ve'edu on this issue. And one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, how do you feel about this issue as a whole in terms of definition of death? And how do you feel about the issue about taking but not giving as well? Because that is an issue, right? I mean, think about it. If you're in Washington and you put yourself on, there have been some high-profile cases where you have a situation. You can imagine someone's waiting for a organ, and they bring them to the hospital in order to receive an organ, and the patient's very sick, dies on the way. And so they're declared dead at the hospital, and the hospital says, okay, we're so sorry we couldn't save your kid, your family member, but they have other organs that are quite vital, like to donate to someone else. And the family says, sorry, we're Orthodox Jews, we won't donate. So there are a couple of high-profile cases like that, which have caused a lot of consternation in the medical community, a little bit in the rabbinic community, whatever it might be. We're not the only ones, by the way. I remember I was speaking about this issue a little bit. One of the things that AMATI does through our Option 18 initiative is do some cultural sensitivity with various organ procurement organizations that are the ones that have monopolies that control organ donation in their given region. And I was talking about this issue. I was very frank with them. Listen, certain segments of the Orthodox community, they will donate. They will not donate, but they will receive. And someone said to me, we have some Christian groups like this as well, whatever it might be. And okay, we're not the only ones, but it raises some issues. It raises some amount of sensitivities. And you can imagine in Israel, it raises a lot of sensitivities. Because if in practice, the Haredi community doesn't donate, they don't. And in practice, the Arab community largely doesn't. There's some exceptions to it, but largely doesn't. So who then ends up being the donors, the organ donors, posthumous organ donors? The Zionists, religious and secular. That gets at all sorts of same types of issues with regard to army service and taking but not giving, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but I said I don't want to get into American politics. I don't want to get into Israeli politics either. But I'm just highlighting for you why I think that this issue became quite sensitive a lot of different ways. Like I said, it doesn't come up every day. And I'll take questions in a moment, but but in the whole state of Israel, in the average year, the possibility of brain stem death, respiratory death, and where the body's healthy enough to have organ donation comes about 180 times a year, like every other day. So it's not a ma'aseh b'chol yom, right? But of course, when it comes up, it's a matter of life and death. That's a matter of life and death. And so that's why I encourage people, as always, talk to your family members about this issue, talk to your Rav about this issue, know where to stand about this issue. And if not now, when? Because we don't know when the next day could bring. Okay, I'll stop here. I have a few other things I'll bring up, but maybe we'll cover some questions as well. If you want some questions come up, you can raise your hand or come off of the.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very informative.
If anybody wants to put a question in the chat, you can do that as well.
I see Josh Udler has raised his hand. So Josh, if you can unmute, even come off.
Hi. I wanted to ask well, two questions really that they're related. The first is, you said there were 11 soldiers who saved 48 lives. When you say saved 48 lives, do you mean that they donated a total of 48 organs, or that 48 people were recipients from those 11 and were able to live beyond it? That's my first question. My second question is, when you say organs save a life after death, what about organs like eyes? Not internal organs that keep the body functioning, but help you see. Thank you.
Great. So as I recall, I think it's 48 lives. There might be more organs that have been donated from those 11. On average, we say one person can save up to 8 lives. In practice, usually on average, a organ donor can donate 3 to 4 organs, right? That's on average. Right, so these 11 soldiers, I'm pretty sure they've saved 48 lives. In a couple of the cases, you had lungs and there's multiple organs being donated. If Rachel's still on, maybe she can clarify that. If not, I'll follow up with you. The issue you're raising about other types of tissues and other things is very important. And here it actually gets into a very, very important issue. Even after cardiac death, meaning after the heart has stopped, the possibility for organ donation can exist. Now, before we get to other organs, so eyes, it's not really eyes, but cornea, heart valves, that is definitely a possibility. Skin became a very big issue in the 70s in Israel after the Yom Kippur War. And there's a real need because of all the burns for a skin bank. And you could say, skin isn't actual, Salas Nefashos. You can argue about that, of course. But in the end, poskim have allowed that, certainly in Israel, but not just in Israel, particularly when there's a shortage. Right? In other words, it's one thing in a society where there's no shortage. I mean, in some ways, this relates a little bit. I don't want to get into all the details, but some of the history about donating your body to science. And like in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, there were those who said if Jews don't want to donate their body to science, they can't go to medical schools. Now, there's a bit of anti-Semitism in there as well, probably more than a bit of anti-Semitism in that also. But the idea there was like this was, but in practice today, there's no shortage of cadavers to be donated and studied in medical schools. So you don't have that same type of acute issue. There's a mass shortage of organs, and this is why this is an issue. So after cardiac death, the technology is developed today to allow for organ retrieval, but it's a little bit complicated. I'll explain why. There is something known as donation after cardiac death. That could include cornea, it can include heart valves, it includes skin. But if it's done in a way in which the cardiac death takes place in a controlled manner, which in practice means the removal of the ventilator, which leads to the patient dying soon afterwards in the surgical room, then we can retrieve organs even after cardiac death. Now, when I first learned about this, I was like, oh, amazing, right? This is death cola deus, right? This is so we can now all support organ donation after cardiac death. But the problem there is that the way it's done is in a controlled manner. So you remove the ventilator to cause the person to die. So you've solved the problem of the time of death, but you've raised other issues of causing a person to die by removing the ventilator. So donation after cardiac death is not a problem in terms of time of death. It's a problem of how that gets caused. But there are opportunities sometimes for cornea to be donated, to bones, and whatnot. And like I said, towers can be done there as well. I'm hopeful, by the way, that the science will develop that we're going to have a situation where there is donation after cardiac death in uncontrolled circumstances. What I mean by that is, let's say someone has a cardiac arrest, shalom, they're rushed to the hospital, they're declared dead, the heart is stopped, and there'll be still ways then to do organ retrieval to maintain the organ vitality. I'm actually working, and Matai is working with a lung transplant group at NYU Hospital that's trying to initiate this protocol. We'll see where it goes, but I'm hopeful that technology is going to develop in that way. And that should get rid of a lot of the issues, right? But we'll see where we get. We'll see where we get.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh, for the question.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Is it okay if I read those?
Please, please.
So one person asked, if it's according to a shita that you could position that you could donate an organ halachically, is it preferable to donate to another Jew? And do you have any control over that?
So the practical answer is you don't have control over it. And the reason is that the system is set up to be based on colorblind, religion-blind criteria. It's based on medical criteria alone. This is to our great benefit, by the way, because Jews are a small minority. Let's say in a place like America, there are clearly many more Jewish recipients than there are Jewish donors. And so that's how the system is set up. And I think that's a lot of benefits to that system. And by the way, in Israel, you have situations where there'll be Jewish donors to Arabs, to non-Jews. In fact, in the case of Lucy D, who's a terror victim, one of her kidneys, if I'm not mistaken, I remember not, but one of her organs went to an Arab. And Rabbi D actually was quite happy about it. We believe in saving lives, and all human beings are created in the image of God. There is a notion in some countries, including America, not in others, of direct donation when you know someone or have some form of relationship with someone who needs an organ. So the classic case is like, this is such a sad case. There's a bouncer at a bar in New Jersey a few years ago. Just an example. And he gets hit in a bar fight, and he falls backwards, and he bangs his head on the curb and suffers brain death. And his daughter needed a liver, I think it was. And so they did, I think they retrieved 5 organs, and one of the liver went to his daughter. They did direct donation there. And, there was a case a couple years ago in New York City where a firefighter fell in a training accident, and a couple of his organs went to other members of the fire department that had organ failure. And the other organs went to the general population. So, I do think it's important to keep that in mind, because at least this doesn't work in England, but in America, that can happen actually. People can have situations where you don't always know, but there can be a situation of organ donation, possibility of organ donation. And when someone knows someone who needs it or knows of someone who knows someone, that type of thing, that can help them, make that final decision. There was a case, I don't want to say where, but there was a case that I was remotely involved in which the family itself was deeply divided about what to do. It's an interesting case in a lot of ways. I don't, it's a small world. I don't get all the details, but the family is deeply divided. And one of the issues that sort of encouraged the family to decide to go through with the donation is that they knew someone through someone else, right, that needed an organ. That organ was able to go to that person. I think that was a source of great nachama. I will tell you in general. I mean, I don't know how much weight you can debate, how much weight to give to this, but organ donation is a source of tremendous nachama to families. Tremendous. This idea that their life still goes on, that this nonsensical death, which frequently happens in crazy ways, terror attacks, car accidents, brain aneurysms, pool drownings, choking on steaks, whatever it might be, is so horrible. And to know that somehow, because from this tragic event, it is brought life to the world, is a source of tremendous nachama to families. I think that is actually a factor to keep in mind sometimes when people are doubting it, not sure about it. I can't tell you how often it's come up when I've met with families of organ donors, and they always talk about that. And many of them have gone on to be the organ recipients, and they build relationships. It's a very beautiful thing. Other question?
There's another question in the chat. It's more of a philosophical question, I guess. The person is saying that, I guess with their experience, they're finding it's very hard to find a modern Orthodox rabbi in America that will sign a living will that accepts brain death as a criteria. So this person is asking, how can you explain this in light of the unified religious Zionist position in Israel? I don't know if that's something.
So you can find non-Orthodox rabbis in America. I can tell you can. I agree that many don't want to speak out about it for all the reasons I mentioned beforehand. It just became really contentious and whatnot. I have a couple of theories why, but for example, let's say someone like Rav Yatz Rimon, Rav of Gush Etzion, who's become a very influential posek across the world. He's a definite supporter of brain death and organ donation. I mean, he's published on this, he's signed on it, I've spoken to him about it, and others. And my theory is as follows: that in America, it's easy to say, easy isn't the right term, but you can stay on the fence on the issue because it doesn't come up that often. The vast majority of rabbis will never get the shaila. And if they do, they'll get it once. And so they'll deal with it case by case. When it comes up, they'll deal with it when it comes up. And so it's easy to sort of say, listen, we'll worry about when it comes up. And I'll deal with it when it comes up. And, maybe, but in Israel, if the rabbinate doesn't support organ donation, there are no organs because you're not going to have a big chunk of the organ donors to be available. And you're not going to have doctors who are going to be willing to be a part of the process. And so I think one of the reasons, and you see this in the writings of the Ramut Rashid, where they say, okay, we have to we have to make a decision in this case, is because they have the national responsibility, a national system on their shoulders. So I think that was one reason that in America, it's easier to say it's a suffix. We're not sure, this or that, because it doesn't come up that often. In Israel, if you don't support this, if you don't allow for it, there's so many organs and people die. By the way, there are countries in the world that have very little organ donation, like Japan. Japan, for cultural and religious reasons, doesn't really accept brain death as much, and they accept brain death, but they don't do organ donation. And you know what happens in Japan? Many people die. You could say that's fine, right? You could say that's fine, right? They don't have organs, but that's ethical, cultural, religious belief. And the religious Zionist poskim, particularly because the Gemara seems to indicate isn't just a test, but is actually a statement of a criteria. felt that we can accept this, and that would allow for organ donation. I want to clarify, by the way, when a person has brainstem death, they're not waking up. And occasionally people will say those stories, they're told they're brain death, but what ends up happening there is the first couple of days come to the hospital, the doctors will say to them, we're testing for brain death, a severe brain injury, whatever it might be. And people in those cases might sometimes never be declared brain dead because they weren't brain dead. There are other times when people are declared brain dead and the hospital won't necessarily will agree for our religious sensitivity not to declare a person dead. In the state of New Jersey, for example, it's the only state in America where the law is actually that you have to, for religious reasons, respect someone's refusal to accept brain death criteria. And people can have their heart beat still for a little bit of time. But no one has ever woken up from a situation where they've been properly tested for brain death. And so the person may stay heart beating for 3 days, 7 days, they're a very healthy body, maybe a month, whatever it might be. But then at some point, the heart's going to stop. Right? So it's not like a case of a coma or vegetative state, right? Where you get to much more bigger dilemmas. And so I have a feeling that also impacts the religious Zionist world, but hard to know. But I think I know many rabbis who will tell me I'm not going to take a strong stand on it. But if a balabayit of mine feels strongly about this, there's yesh al ma lismoch, yesh al mi lismoch, and if they want to be a donor, I'll support that. And I tell them, call us up, we'll help you out, in terms of the brain death declaration and whatnot, dealing with the doctors. But like I said, it doesn't come up every day.
If somebody else has asked, if somebody is looking for a rabbi in their community who they think has a good understanding of these issues and they can ask this, is that something AIMATAI can help refer them to? Okay,
sure.
So they could also reach out to you to ask.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll put my email in the chat, but I don't actually have access to the full chat here. I'm not seeing it. I'll give it to you.
It might be the way the Zoom was initially
That's fine,
set
no
up settings.
No problem.
But if you send it to me, I'll put it in now.
We have a contact us page on AIMATAI's website as well, and I'm happy to help people find local. When it comes up, people can also just call us directly. Like I said, I'm not trying to minimize the importance of the issue. It's an important issue, but for the vast majority of people, this is not. And you can see here our helplines. You can see this. We'll help people, but for the vast majority of people, it's not going to be relevant. I mean, I've gotten calls from people, and they'll say to me, like, mom just died in home hospice, and we realized she was an organ donor. We didn't take care of this. Well, if mom was in home hospice at 84 at the end of a battle with cancer, her organs weren't going to be able to be retrievable, right? In other words, it's not the way the body works in terms of that system. So, like I said, the vast majority of cases, but, if you want to leave in a halachic living will or AIMATAI's living will, others, and you want to direct them to speak to us if the issue comes up, and we're certainly happy to help connect people to local rabbis as well as needed.
Are there any other questions anybody wants to ask? All right. Well, there was a lot of information to process. Sometimes the questions come afterwards. So it's good to know that there's a contact page on the AIMATAI website, and people can certainly still ask their questions. And if anything is time sensitive and relevant, 100%, they should. Right. And of course, can reach out to their own local rabbis also now, perhaps to learn more about their positions on this issue and understand them better. That's always a good thing to do. When it isn't time sensitive, right? It's a good question.
Always, where it comes up the most is when people say, what should I do at the DMV?
Yes.
So, and I say to people, it's less important what you do at the DMV is what you say to your family members, right? And that's much more important on it. But if you go to our website, option18.org, you can see all sorts of educational material there as well, and the local rabbis, and happy to follow up with people. I hope we were able to talk about this, Audrey, in a way that's not polemical, and everyone's calm and collected, and Baruch Hashem, we can restore this discussion back to being like a normal debate about like how do you warm up tea on Shabbos? I don't know, make tea on Shabbos. I agree. There's more issues at stake here. I get it. But we need to get a little bit closer to that.
anything that lowers the temperature in conversation. And then even if you don't get to haskama, agreement, but you're able to talk in respectful ways, that's always a good thing. And we are so grateful to you for not only talking about this topic, but reminding us of the way to frame it, and the way to frame really any topic is through conversation and discussion in a respectful manner. So appreciative. Once again, you made everything very accessible. I am deeply appreciative on behalf of Beaker Holm of Greater Washington, to Rabbi Dr. Brody of AMATI, and to Rachel had to leave us, Rachel Secunda, but for all her behind the scenes support, and to Menachem Hamburger for his behind the scenes support, and to all of you for taking time out of your Sunday to attend. There will be a recording, and of course we'll send it out. And you can always, as I said, go to the AMATI website to learn more quickly as well. Have a great Sunday, everybody, and may we continue to hear Besorah Tova, good news from Eretz Israel for all of Am Israel and the world. Have a good day. Be well.